As we're saying, Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem, as the cantor sang it, I was thinking myself that Kikedem doesn't have to go so far back. I wish that we were on Sukkot of 57, 80, just a year ago, where we could celebrate in a very different way. But here we are, and our job is to make the most out of this, to be real with it, and to experience it as best as we can. And that I see as my challenge with the words that I will speak now. There are 4 different people in my family over this past week that in one conversation or another said to me either, David or Abba, I feel really blessed by life. And then each of them told me how they felt blessed, how they felt lucky in some way or another. As Myrna Gross would say, poo, poo, poo. But it gave me reason to pause because I felt like they were setting me up for Sukkot. A wonderful sense that we have on this holy day that we are richly blessed. Most people, considering the changed conditions, considering the fact that most people are rather isolated, that people cannot join together with friends or work associates or extended family, faced with an unknown future, witnessing the horrors of our political discourse and fearing the possible destruction of our democracy, most people aren't saying, well, I feel really lucky these days. But most of you also have moments where you realize that you are lucky and that you could change your perspective, focus on something which you really say is a blessing. And you say, I'm blessed by God, I am blessed by good fortune to be alive. Do you remember the famous story about Yitzhak Perlman? Years ago, I told the story. I'm sure you heard it in many different contexts. It's attributed to him, the great violinist. And then I did a Snopes search on it and saw that it may not have been he at all, but another violinist from over 150 years ago by the name of Niccolo Paganini. Well, an E string broke in their concert, and that happened to both of them. The violinist Paganini continued to play with just 3 strings, and everyone marveled. And when the concert was over, the violinist was noted to have said, what's important in our lives is that we make music out of what we have left. It is a good piece of advice for our own time. There is a report that Perlman actually did break a string in a concert in New York, but he didn't continue to play. Rather, he spent 45 minutes doing stand-up comedy. That is making the best out of his situation, a very difficult situation and perhaps what could have been an embarrassing situation. We're challenged to make the best out of the situation we find ourselves in. When thinking about the preparations for these holy days, it was quite clear what we would do for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We would read words and articulate messages, sing the melodies of our prayers that we're so familiar with and touch us so deeply. And those could all be pretty easily transferred, to an online platform. But holding a lulav and an etrog and smelling it and shaking the lulav, going into the sukkah, feeling the physicality of this particular chag, that's a very different thing. But these are our 3 strings. We have them. And we're challenged to feel the blessing of this time, and we're challenged to celebrate it. You know that this holiday is a recollection of a number of things. These understandings come from different times in our people's history. Religiously, it's to remind us of the protection that God gave our people as they wandered in the wilderness. Historically, it's a reminder of the booths that we built. either during the period of the wandering or during the harvest when we were in our own land. And as you know, this is referred to as Man Simchatenu. So I want to ask you then, and I ask myself the same question, how do we access that joy when we cannot do those things that we did to express that joy? Zman Simchatenu, the time of our joy. We're commanded to rejoice. You know, we don't have that commandment in relation to Passover. We don't have that commandment in relation to Shavuot. But on this Yom Tov, we're commanded to rejoice. Why is that? Well, a number of things have been suggested. Passover and Shavuot both reflect a beginning or a middle of harvest. It's not all complete yet. And so there's still some uncertainty. But this Chag is at the end of the harvest. And so whatever we have gathered, whatever we have gleaned, whatever produce we have to have a sense of gratitude, a sense of fulfillment, and express our joy. There's no longer an insecurity as to whether a particular crop will grow or not, or whether there would be rain or not for this harvest. It's already over. And so we rejoice in the successes that we have. But that beckons another question. The other question is, if this is Man Simchatenu and we feel some security in that we've already gained from our harvest, then why are we going into huts which are pretty insecure and frail? We know that the sukkah is meant to be an impermanent structure. We know that a sukkah can be blown over. We know that it has a shabby roof. It can be destroyed by winds. Or Canadian brothers and sisters probably have seen snow on their Sukkot more than once. So let me share some suggestions about this being Zman Simchatenu. Years ago, there is a rabbi, a true scholar, who suggested that we look towards an archaeological find with the word simcha on it. It was developed on a it was found on a stone tablet, and it didn't mean joy, but rather what it meant was acceptance or the conclusion of a contract. In our simcha then was experienced at the end of Yom Kippur. The contract was complete. We hope or we believe that our plea before God was acceptable. And so that's the moment of relief. And after Yom Kippur, we express that simcha. But I think the idea of acceptance can also relate to something else and something very important. My sense is that people need surety, people need security, but some people feel they need it all the time. There are people who always need to feel that they are right. There are people that always need to feel that they have control over the situation and that they're going to determine what's going to happen next. And what I've noticed is the people who live life with such assurance, the people who live life with a sense that they have to control everything around them or all the people around them, seem to be people who have difficulty experiencing happiness because they're always on guard. They're often anxious, and somewhere deep inside of themselves, perhaps they realize they're not going to be able to control everything, and that creates some fear and defensiveness. They don't control their environment. And so we move ourselves out into a place, into the sukkah, and realize that we're not going to control things. It's taught to us by the building. Our power is going to be limited. It could rain every day of Sukkot. And I think we can live, when we can live in that place, when we can live with a sense that we don't know everything and we can't control everything, and when we accept that is part of being human, we can have a greater sense of comfort and peace. We realize then, as we are in the sukkah looking up, or as we think about this, that we're part of something much larger than ourselves. And as being part of that, we're also subservient to it. Acceptance of that reality is a sign of both emotional and spiritual maturity. Emotional and spiritual maturity is being able to say, I'm not going to be able to control the people around me. I can only control myself. Emotional and spiritual maturity says there's something larger in this world. We don't know everything, and none of us are going to determine tomorrow's weather. What is, and what will be, and we can live in this moment. When we give up that sense of control, when we realize life is filled with that uncertainty, when we cannot predict what will be next, a dimension of our very being, of our spirit's change. It is ironically then that we find more comfort. It is then that we can bring ourselves to acceptance. And it's then that we can understand that we can live with faith and with hope, but not with surety. It's a sign, as I said, of emotional and spiritual maturity. We don't know everything, and we can't control everything. We can allow ourselves to then be fearful about that reality, or we take a deep breath and understand that that's the universe that we're in. And in that will come some peace. In that will come some liberation. And maybe even in that comes some simcha, some joy. The second idea in all of this is that we're required to express a sense of gratitude and wonder. We look up into the sky and we see that creation is truly magnificent. We look at the trees and the fruits and the produce around us, and we have to say, we are grateful. More than that, we're not only expressing gratitude, but we have made Sukkot a type of contemporary thanksgiving with an emphasis also on giving. So it's a time when our community and many communities collect food for the poor and express the need to reach out to the homeless and those who care for the homeless. These insufficient huts make us reflect on the importance of home. So as you know, in this congregation every year on this day, for the last number of years, we've heard from people from Family Promise, the organization in town that takes care of homeless people. And this year, our collection of food is I'm encouraging it to increase as big as it possibly can. We have a woman in this congregation who works for us, who works for the people of this community, who works for everybody, named Summer Fairman. And Summer has organized and been a driving force between these collections of food. And this year she celebrates her birthday on Monday. We encourage each and every one of you to come by the synagogue anytime this week. Drop off canned goods and dry goods. We will make a contribution both to the Jacobson Food Pantry and to the places of need in this community. I want to say then that we think that our insecurity can lead to anxiety, and it's a bad thing. But if we think about it in a little bit of a different way, and that is we're all insecure in some way. And so then we embrace it. And it leads to a realization of how much we need others and how much others are needed by us. So being human also is part of this story in terms of insecurity. But in that, we can find the reassurance and comfort from what we are given. But also, we find reassurance and comfort from what we give. Think of your own life. Think of the meaning of something as simple as a greeting card that you receive or that you send when there's sickness. A phone call that you receive or that you make when you're feeling down. A hug that you receive or that you give when you're frightened. Sukkot makes us understand these things, these issues of our own insecurity and our interdependence. It is the human condition but it provides opportunities. And finally, I want to speak about one other aspect of this Sukkot when we are not able to gather together, to be together doing Kiddush out in the Sukkah as one community. I want to speak about the idea of imagination. When talking about the Sukkah, Rabbi Eliezer in the Talmud believed that the Sukkah was really a symbolic representation of God's comforting and protective presence. It reflected the fact that God was with us in the wilderness. And although there are a vast number of authorities that believe something differently, and that it has to do with the actual physical huts that were built, for Rabbi Eliezer, imagination of a sukkah has great meaning. So let me share a story about Benjamin Disraeli. You are all familiar with Disraeli. He was the first British Prime Minister of Jewish ancestry. And although Disraeli never denied his Jewish roots, we know that his father baptized him in the Anglican Church when he was 12 years old. Anti-Semites never forgave Disraeli's Jewishness, and they always identified him as a Jew. Well, Disraeli wrote a novel. The name of the novel was Tancred. It was published in 1847. It was about a young British nobleman who had a spiritual longing to visit the Holy Land. And when he arrived, he spent time with a Jewish family, and he became acquainted with Jewish religious life. His visit coincided with Sukkot, so he was shown the lulav and the etrog and brought into a sukkah. Tancred was deeply, deeply impressed by what he saw. And Disraeli wrote, quote, "The vineyards of Israel have ceased to exist in our time. But it's so interesting that the eternal law enjoins the children of Israel to continue to celebrate those vineyards, to continue to celebrate the vintage, a race that persists in celebrating their vintage of the past. And although they'll have no fruits to gather today, they will one day regain their vineyards," Disraeli wrote in the middle of the 19th century. He said, "What an indomitable spirit the Jews have." He noted that it's far easier for Sephardim who live in regions of the Mediterranean to observe the festival, since they can identify with the climate and the setting of the earlier generations of the Israelites who celebrated the holiday. And he said, "But picture yourself in the squalid quarters of some bleak northern town in Europe where there's never a sun that can ripen grapes. And yet the Jew there celebrates the vintage of the people of Palestine." Disraeli then continued with a description of the ways that Jews have suffered in the ghettos in Europe. As he said, living among fog and filth, never treated with kindness, impoverished, seldom knowing justice. Conceive such a condition and understand that in their squalor, in their lives, the Jews were filled with images and passions that rank amongst the most beautiful and gorgeous of the human experience. On Sukkot, they would experience joy. They would be exuberant. They would drink wine, and they would eat fruit. Even the most downtrodden Jew in observing Sukkot finds real joy. The outside world may be cruel and ugly, but their inner life was joyous and noble. The external conditions may not be happy, but they created internal happiness because they remembered their joy. The Jew, while remembering the glories of the past, also dreams of the future glories of his people. Disraeli pointed to an important truth, and we know this truth. Happiness is essentially an internal phenomenon, a matter of one's attitude and interpretation of reality. External conditions are less vital to genuine happiness than one's internal state of mind. As Viktor Frankl said, when all else is lost, we still have the freedom to choose how we respond. How amazing is Disraeli's description. And it made me think of the scene in Fiddler on the Roof, the scene when Tevye rushed home to the Shabbos table to be with his daughters and his wife. And he puts on his kapata and his hat, and he blesses his children. And they sing the Sabbath prayer. And what we see is a table that's fit for kings and queens in that impoverished village of Anatevka. There is an imagination that also accompanies every Shabbat. Every one of us becomes like a king and a queen, like a royal family. Each one of us is blessed and has the capacity to bless. And even during times where there was no money, we set the most beautiful tables and we created the most delicious foods. So this year may be a year where imagination is much more important. We're not together in the sukkah, but we can imagine it. Albert Einstein once said that the true brilliance of the Jewish people is because their God does not exist in any material representation or form. He could not or she could not ever be seen. And so it demands imagination. Einstein's brilliance was also in his imagination. He did thought experiments. He allowed his mind to go to other places, and then he applied his brilliant capacity for objective and reasonable examination. We have to be imagining these days. We not only remember what was, but we're going to imagine what can be. So we need imagination, we need dreams. And you know what we have learned, and what we'll always hold on to, is that our dreams can create reality. Our dreams can create satisfaction. Our dreams create simcha. They create joy. Let me conclude with the following wish. I hope that we can feel acceptance for what we have. I hope we can feel appreciation for where we are. And I hope we can feel gratitude for these things. Sukkot teaches us that we don't need much to be happy. That's been a lesson we've also learned during these days. We realize how much we have, and that's not what makes us happy. We realize we could be happy with less. It reminds us that we perhaps have too much. But finally, and most importantly, may we continue to dream of beautiful Sukkot. Sukkot of the past and Sukkot of the future, where we will together once again say l'chaim and drink wine, celebrate the vineyard and the harvest, and allow us ourselves to realize God's goodness. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. We'll turn now to the Musaf service, page 155. Page 155, the Chatzikat.